Hello, everyone. We're here for a new live webinar, Facing Business Immigration Challenges in Canada and How the LMIA Owner-Operator Can Be the Answer. Thank you to everyone who's already here. We have overall, I believe I forgot to confirm with the team how many people we have registered, but I think it's around 300 people. Welcome, everybody. We already have, so we're expecting from those 300 at least for 160 to be actively here attending, and we're now at almost 90 people are jumping in. So we'll wait for a few minutes, and as usual, I like to ask where people are connecting from. Hi, Rohit, Calgary. And how's the weather in each place? Toronto. Vancouver. Hi, Calvin. Paris. Beautiful. Super cold. Okay. Toronto, New Brunswick, Indonesia. Georgina, thank you. Thank you for joining despite the time difference. Okay, so we're getting close to almost 100 people. So in about a minute, I'll be starting. Burlington, Windsor, Ontario. Great. So welcome everyone to our latest webinar. We'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes. In the meantime, I'll begin by introducing myself. For those who don't know me, my name is Marianela Mansour. I'm partner and global director of sales and marketing here at Joorney, and I'm going to be your host today. Let's see how many people we have, and we'll get started. I think we can get started now. Let me try to hit this. This is what I wanted to do. Okay, so as many of you are aware, several significant changes to Canadian business immigration policies in the recent months have raised questions about which programs are now most suitable for different applicants. When we first planned the webinar, our focus was on the LMIA Owner-Operator program as a solution of some of these challenges. However, since then, IRCC, as you know, announced changes to express entry, specifically on the removal of the LMIA-based job offer points. So we'll be definitely discussing that. This has reshaped the immigration landscape, leading us to also explore the potential impact on LMIA owner-operator applicants and also examine alternative pathways. Today, we're going to take a closer look at the LMIA owner-operator program. We're going to be covering everything from the basics, eligibility, recent changes, implications, and we'll also discuss a few alternative options. To provide professional guidance and expert insights, I'm delighted to introduce Jade Calver. Jade is a Toronto-based RCIC with extensive experience working with LMIA owner-operator clients, ICTs, startup visa, and many more. Jade has collaborated with us on numerous projects over the past 3 years, and we're thrilled to have her with us today. In addition to supporting individual clients, Jade also advises other immigration consultants by co-counseling and also teaching through her own platform, which she will also mention during the webinar so that you can join that as well. Thank you for joining us and welcome, Jade.
Hey, Marianela. Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you, Jade, for being here. And I know many people here probably already know you because you're very well known in the industry. And I know you're very busy. So thank you very much for taking the time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And I'm gonna jump in. I was gonna say also, if anybody has any questions, there's a question tab on the right-hand side. For everybody who's here and also people who registered and not attended, everybody will receive the recording at the end. And then you also have a chat option on the right hand side. Okay, and we'll be going through questions with Jade as usual, and then at the end we'll have a space for Q&A. And we'll get some of the questions that you already gave us through registration, and then we'll take a few from the audience. Let's get going then. So Jade, could you explain the main changes recently introduced to Canadian immigration programs?
Sure. So, I mean, before we start out, I think that I should probably preface it by saying we're saying owner-operator, LMIA, but I know we have lots of RCICs and immigration lawyers in attendance. If you go online after and try to find owner-operator LMIA on the ESDC website, it doesn't actually exist anymore. So we'll clarify that, but you still can do it. It's just there's no specific category for the owner-operator anymore. So we do have, I want to be clear on that. And then furthermore, the biggest change that I think that a lot of people have been asking us here is about the points that are going to be allocated through our federal program, which is the Express Entry program. So at the moment, through our main federal program, if you have an LMIA, you can be granted 50 or 200 points in the Express Entry program. The federal government announced in the fall, as part of its anti-LMIA fraud measures, that they're going to be potentially, well, they've said we're going to take away the points in the Express Entry program. So we aren't sure how that's going to play out vis-a-vis these LMIAs, which under the owner-operator program are usually high-skilled, which would grant our clients 200 points. So we're not sure if those 50 or 200 points will both be taken away, or if it will be just the 50 points that are removed. LMIA exempt work permits, certain work permits can also claim for those points. So that's a big change that's upcoming. And then the third thing that I wanted to mention is that we saw caps introduced. I do a lot of startup visa applications. And so we saw in 2024, the government introduced caps to the startup visa program. So these designated entities, so the incubators that can support for startup visa, they're now only allowed 10 spots per incubator to support startup visa companies. So that was the last big change. So many changes afoot at IRCC over the past few months, which I think for a lot of those in the audience who are immigration practitioners are, it's a lot to keep up with, but I'm here to hopefully provide some clarity on those changes.
Yes, thank you, Jade. And also the ICT, right, with the additional country requirement from abroad.
Can you repeat that? I didn't catch that first part.
No, I was going to say that also the change with the ICT.
Correct, exactly. So ICT, so it's an LMIA-based, LMIA exempt work permit, which is the intra-company transferee work permit program. So ICT, the government announced that under GATT, so that's the General Agreement on Trades and Service. So previously, if you had a foreign business from any country and you were operational there, you could do a startup work permit under the ICT program to come. Now, the government has said you have to be what's called a multinational corporation, or an MNC for short, which means that you need to have operations in 2 countries before you can file for a work permit to come to Canada. So that's a fairly major change to that program as well.
Yes, for sure. I mean, I empathize now with RCICs and immigration lawyers because there's certainly many limitations. What's happening? What's the trend about how federal government is, like, what are they giving priority to?
Yeah, so, well, at the moment it seems like it's nothing, but as far as someone who practices a lot of corporate immigration and strategies for entrepreneurs, it would seem as though there is a a movement away from, with startup visa, we saw a lot of attention. It was cool, it was hip, it was sexy. They said, we're bringing innovative businesses to Canada. The provinces were being innovative themselves. They were setting up these business programs. Ontario even started with their entrepreneur program, for example. They reinvested money into it, and they lowered the threshold for how much you had to invest. But recently, over the past year, the government has tightened things up, both at the federal level and the provincial programs. They have just paused them completely. And now what we're seeing is the governments are really just focusing on the run-of-the-mill economic class programs. Family class is also, still remains open, but generally speaking, there's a tightening up overall, I would say, as a trend. And it's really, unless you've got a master's degree and speak French and English, like, it's challenging right now as an applicant to transition to permanent residency. So it's not that it's not doable. I am an optimist when it comes to immigration. I'm realistic, but I am optimistic. But you do really, as a practitioner who is helping a business client through the immigration process, it's no longer, back in the day, we would do, this LMIA, and then we knew that they would get permanent residency through express entry, or same thing for startup visa. We would just do startup visa, and that was it. That was the permanent residency application. Whereas now, when a business client comes to me and they're wanting to set up a business and go through the immigration process, we have to have plan A, B, and C, because our clients, a lot of the time, they're investing a lot of money and they don't have that money, they don't want to lose it, and who would? And so they're investing a lot of time and money into the program. So we have to be ready with some backups for them to make sure that if, plan A doesn't work, such as there's a major policy change in express entry, what's plan B and plan C for them to make sure that they are able to transition to permanent residency, if that's the goal for them. Most of my clients want permanent residency, not all, but most.
Exactly. No, definitely agreeing with you. Similar to tax planning, it now has become immigration planning. So it's not only checking one program, one eligibility, but like you say, plans A, B, C, because a lot it's at stake, right? It's a big life change. It's you, your family, many different aspects of like changes and impacts in life. So it needs to be definitely well planned. Jade, so understanding all these limitations, and before we get into the details of the owner-operator as an option, what business immigration programs are you currently working with?
Sure. So the most popular ones, we like express entry still for entrepreneurs. It's still open, it's still available. Startup visa, I've worked with for many years since it was a pilot program. So we like that program. And then temporary programs. So I like the ICT work permit, which you mentioned earlier, C10, C11 work permits. I do a lot of treaty permits. So through CUSMA, for example, especially for our Mexican nationals. So it's more so, and as practitioners, I host a forum for consultants and lawyers. And often they're trying, they have a program and they're trying to, fit a square peg into a round hole, so to speak, because they are trying to fit their client into there. So we really are boutique in that we, want to get to know our clients and really hold their hands through the process. And I think that, I always advocate for being a good representative, not just through, and especially with our business clients, because it's not just the visa that you have to worry about. It's, do you have you helped them and directed them towards tax planning? What about their children? Lots of our business people have children. Have you planned it out so that they'll have a seamless transition from maybe secondary to university studies in Canada? Do they have, are they guided as far as their real estate needs and investing? Do they understand the restrictions in Canada right now? So it's really, we take a holistic approach to our business entrepreneurs, because we really want to make sure that they, they're busy running their business. We want to make sure that they're well taken care of when it comes to everything A to Z as part of the process.
Definitely, and now more than ever, that hand-holding is going to be extremely valued by all applicants that come to everybody's way. They're going to be expecting that for sure.
Yeah.
Jade, so let's jump into the LMI owner-operator now. Let's talk about the basics, an overview of what the program entails.
Sure. So the owner-operator program, as I said, those of you who are practitioners who attend this webinar, then you go and look at ESDC's website, you may find an archived page that talks about the owner-operator. So why we still call it the owner-operator is that ESDC had a program where you could file if you were a majority shareholder of a Canadian business. You could file for what was called an owner-operator, LMIA. And so it allowed you to not advertise for 4 weeks as part of the application. We filed to ESDC and they reviewed it as such. A couple of years ago, the government said, that's done. You're not doing this anymore. I'm assuming the program became too popular. And they said, you have to go through our regular channels. So it was at the time was confusing for us as practitioners because we're like, what does this mean? And so effectively, it just means that you have to put the owner operator is not dead. It's just as a program, you now have to put these applications. So that's where the applicant who is both the applicant, and you have to think of these applications as the applicant is both the employer, because if I buy, ABC Inc. in Toronto, as the majority shareholder, I'm the employer, but I am filing for an LMIA as me, Jade Calver, as an employee to come work as the CEO or president, whatever, of ABC Inc. in Toronto. So sometimes it's hard to wrap your head around that, but that's effectively what it is. So as the majority shareholder of the Canadian business, and this can be any business in Canada, but we'll talk about the tips and tricks for what kinds of businesses get approved for these. But effectively what happens is that as with the high wage or the PR supporting application, we advertise the position for 4 weeks, demonstrate that there was a labor shortage within the Canadian company, and then we file through the regular temporary foreign worker program for this position. And then what happens is that, well, if there's an interview, you get an interview with the officer. And at the end of the process, the person is issued a positive LMIA. And so this LMIA, well, at the moment, you can use it for a work permit, which will get you a 3-year closed work permit to come and work at the company in Canada. And currently it will still give you 50, but usually 200 points in the express entry program. But again, disclaimer for everybody, come the spring, we'll see what happens with those points.
Okay, so that means that when the job is advertised for 4 weeks, the expectation or the positive expectation for the applicant is that there's nobody in Canada that can take that job, correct?
Exactly. So I know it seems counterintuitive because you're both the same person. You're the employer and the employee. So you're essentially showing how nobody else can beat you out of the job, but that's how the process works.
Exactly. Okay. Yes, it's a little bit difficult to wrap your head around it, but it's basically going the regular LMIA route, but
Correct.
for somebody who's the owner and employee. Okay.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Sorry to interrupt. It seems counterintuitive, but I clarified years ago when they made the change to the owner-operator program, and I drilled the officers at ESDC, and I said, so I just have to advertise, and the applicant reviews the candidates, correct? And they clarified that's how it works. And so that at the moment, if you are filing for an LMIA for your own business in Canada, this is how it works. You advertise the position, you screen the candidates, and you submit a regular LMIA application, which includes proof of business legitimacy, job offer, proof that you couldn't find a Canadian, so your recruitment efforts, and then the application forms.
Okay, understood. And in the job offer, you won't mention how much that person would be investing.
No, so I don't. In the advertisements and in the job offer letter, so I did this once, I learned the hard way. The officer was going to approve my LMIA. It's my only owner operator I've ever had a refusal on. And I used to do it. I had done it with all of my other previous owner-operator applications. And then I had it in here. I said that something to the effect of investment in the business is required as part of the whatever it was, compensation package, part of a contingent on getting the job offer. And the officer said to me, you can't do that because that is not what a regular Canadian company would do. So therefore, it is not a reasonable employment requirement, and therefore we're refusing the application. So we ended up reapplying without that one little line, and they approved it, but it wasted 3 months of time, but whatever. But that's generally as a rule, no, I do not include any kind of investment requirement in the ads anymore.
Okay. Good that we now can learn from your experience as well, Jade. And I think a few people had the same issue with the owner operator back then, and then they learned and didn't add that. Let's talk about the benefits for foreign business owners that use the owner operator route.
Sure. So, I mean, a few benefits here. Why I like it, people will often challenge me because they'll say, well, I qualify for an ICT work permit, or maybe we should just do a C11 work permit. But the nice part about an LMIA is that you can test the waters when it comes to the approval without it going on a candidate's permanent immigration record. If you file for, let's say, an ICT work permit or a C11 work permit, it goes on their permanent immigration record, which can affect immigration because you have to declare it forever when you're applying for immigration visas to other countries, which as a business person, you really don't want on your record. And so I like the LMIA for that reason. And on a similar note, so once you get to the work permit application process, when you're applying for these LMIA exempt work permits, there's a lot of, subjectivity that is afforded to the officer who's determining the decision on your work permit, because not only are they deciding, okay, is this person qualified for this role, but they also get the job of determining, okay, is this a legitimate job offer? Does the business exist, etc., which I don't really like to give the officers the ability to do. And so if you are filing for a work permit with this LMIA, the fact that it's a legitimate job offer already exists within the within the scope of the work permit. So there's less than an officer can refuse us on when we're filing for an LMIA based work permit, because they depend on ESTC to determine that it is a legitimate job offer. So yeah, I think that's it. So if you get a refusal, which again, I've been doing LMIAs for over 10 years, I've filed hundreds a year. I think I've had 2 refusals in that time. So if you do it properly, like, they have fairly high approval rates. And then the work permit application process overall, anecdotally, of course, but in my experience, there's less of a chance of refusal on that work permit application.
Okay. Understood. We have many RCICs here and a few immigration lawyers as well. I would love to hear interesting case studies from your experience, Jade, to see like what types of what kinds of businesses get approved. What has been your experience overall on that?
Sure. So I have a few that I jotted down here. So these were all done within the last 2 years. So one was a couple from South Africa. They purchased a couple of print shops in British Columbia, and we had them with Joorney. We did also, for everyone watching, I include a business plan with all of these applications. So we had them do a business plan with Joorney. And so then we had them complete a conditional agreement of purchase and sale for the companies. They put in a small deposit, and then we filed for an LMIA for one of the owners. And so they, as a president or CEO, and so it was approved. Actually, they didn't even interview us. They gave us the approval directly. And then what happened is that this particular client, her education and language levels were such that she was actually competitive for express entry immediately. And so she'd actually never been to Canada before, and we applied for express entry, and within 6 months she was approved for permanent residency. So that was which is interesting, because I know I keep in contact with these clients. They have they've met some other South Africans who are in that region of BC, who they went through other pathways to get their work permits, for example, and they're still waiting on permanent residency. So that was a really great way to use that owner-operator LMIA. Another one was a client came to me. He was living in the United States, operating an accounting firm, but he had some visa refusals to come to Canada already. So we were a little bit worried about doing work permits for him. Mm-hmm. And so we had him open up a branch in Canada of his accounting firm. He ran it for a year and added staff to the Canadian operation. And then we filed for, again, the owner-operator LMIA, approved without an interview once again, and then he subsequently did an express entry application, which was then approved. So these are some cases where we actually did it without the work permits. But we've done many for owner-operators who have set up or purchased a company who they want to come in just on a work permit because maybe they're not moving permanently, or they come in for a little bit and then they transition to permanent residency. It's important to note that express entry, the points, as we all know, are quite competitive. So sometimes this LMIA is a tool to then maybe get the family to Canada, and then we use the spouse to qualify through express entry or one of the provincial programs. It's not always the actual business owner that we're using as the principal applicant. So that's why I say, we have to be strategic as practitioners to really, to come up with plan A, B, and C.
Exactly, for sure. Jade, so you're talking about businesses. In one case, it's a purchase. The other one is 1 year operational. So let's talk about that part of the eligibility. Sure. The business needs to be fully operational before applying, or can it be a new startup?
Right. So yes and yes. So it can be a startup, but you have to be an operational startup, as I like to call it. So, I mean, the LMIA rules, if you look at the regulations, they say that to get a positive determination, one of the criteria that officers can look at, because the whole point of the LMIA is to determine, is this going to have a positive or negative effect on the labor market if we let this company hire a foreign national? So one of the rules is that they have to see, can the company actually afford the foreign national to work at the Canadian business? And so if you're not operational and you don't have any revenue, that's where officers will start to question if it's legitimate or not. So that's where, if it's a complete startup, it really depends, It depends on the type of company that's coming in. If it's a construction company, forget about it. Unless you have like millions of dollars of revenue and you have a few locations and you're operational, you're not going to get one of these senior managerial LMIAs. Whereas if you're a tech startup and you have significant investment, maybe I've done ones before. I had a case in Kingston, and they had support from the university there. They were a healthcare startup. They weren't really that operational, honestly, but there was such significant investment and proof of legitimacy of the project that it allowed us to file for the application, and the business had only been incorporated 3 months prior.
Interesting. That's an interesting example. And now that you touch upon the investment, what is the eligibility like overall? Is there a number? Is it something you recommend?
Yeah, so there is no number that you'll find anywhere written for these applications, but generally speaking, I like to see in the first year, so like when we're doing the business plan, that there's going to be at least $300,000 Canadian in turnover. Because if you have to think about it logically, like if you are doing one of these LMIAs that requires a senior manager to work at it at the Canadian business, well, if you're only turning over $50,000 a year, but you have to pay your senior manager $140,000 a year, well, the math doesn't add up. So, I usually say $300,000 as like the minimum investment to make it happen.
Okay, that makes sense for sure. So we were talking about an example where they were buying a business, right? And I've heard a lot of things about that, like that it increases the chances of approvals, but at the same time, I've heard from applicants and some immigration professionals that they're saying it's so difficult sometimes with brokers on how to set up the negotiation with the seller so that they're willing to wait and that they have patience. So what are the benefits and also like challenges of buying a business as an option for the owner operator?
Sure. So, I mean, the nice part about it is that, as I mentioned earlier, if there is a operational business, so then, if the business has been operational for 10 plus years, check. You don't have to have any, you won't get, you shouldn't get too much pushback from the officer at Service Canada about the operations of the actual Canadian business. But with regards to the actual negotiations and purchases, I mean, you can work with a business broker. You can also work with real estate agents. A lot of them will actually help you, go and find these businesses that are for sale. Especially in Canada at the moment, people who have successful businesses, they're actually pretty hush-hush about the fact that their business is for sale. So often, reaching out to chambers of commerce can be a really great way to try to connect with business communities as well, because often the best businesses, they don't go online for sale. And then when you're starting the process with a seller in Canada, you really do have to, ensure that they have patience through the process, because even with a successful application, like my clients who purchased the print shops, I think it was about a year until they could actually finalize the transaction. So, and I think now it would be even longer with the way that LMIA processing times are going. So you do really have to make sure that there is patience on both ends when it comes to these transactions. And that's why we see the deposits happening a lot of the time, because it gives the sellers at least some peace of mind that they're getting something for it, even if things don't work out.
Exactly. That's a good way to handle it for sure. And we're definitely seeing from what I've heard that approval rates when a business is purchased are higher. Is that correct, or is that only a rumor?
Well, I think that is probably always been the trend because of the operational ability of the Canadian entity. Because with a startup, I think that people get refusals because they rush to file for LMIAs for these startups without having any proof of operations in the Canadian market. So I think that it's a result of maybe people rushing to file these LMIAs, whereas if you have some patience and really hustle and the client works hard and starts up the business in Canada, that's where you're going to see the approval on the LMIA.
Exactly. And also for the applicant, right? Because there are many applicants that have never been to Canada, and it's good to buy something that it's already operating, maybe when this where the seller is involved, so the risk of the business is actually lower. I remember, Jade, we were talking about it with you this week about some people investing a lot of money on maybe a startup visa possibility, and in those cases, there's huge uncertainty about whether that startup is going to succeed or not. While if you purchase, let's say, a more traditional business from all those baby boomers that are retiring, you have something that is tangible. You already have a cash flow, you have revenue, you have employees that they're going to protect their jobs. So many things that make the application way safer, right?
Exactly. And yeah, I think that Well, I have a lot of clients who come to me and they rush to do startup visa because, again, it's exciting and it's all over the news. But the truth of the matter is that even if you get approved for permanent residency, a lot of the time, these startups fail, unfortunately. The stats aren't great for these tech startups. Whereas if you buy a less exciting business, a brick and mortar store, like a shoe store, and that's been in operation for 20 years in a small town, well, the client base is there, or, a print shop or a graphic design shop, as it was, like the businesses, or, as I've done it before for an accounting firm. Like, you're not reinventing the wheel when it comes to the business.
Exactly.
You purchase something that's dependable, it makes money, and then you, with your family, you can come to Canada, and you have, as we know in Canada, the way to make money is not as an employee, it's as a business owner. And so you can arrive in Canada with that. Obviously you have to do the work, but you've got a little bit more guaranteed revenue that's going to make you successful in the Canadian market.
Yes, definitely. How long does the application usually take, Jane?
Sure. So LMIAs, ESTC is supposed to process these high wage applications within 10 days, but they never do. They seem to always stick to the regular processing time. So I tell clients right now, plan on 4 to 6 months for processing.
Okay, 4 to 6 months. Perfect. So Jade, under the current circumstances of the LMIA owner-operator, where there's uncertainty about the points, when you're advising your client to maybe purchase a business, what would be their next step in case they do want to go for permanent residency? You were mentioning some at the beginning, something regarding the spouse or other alternatives.
Yeah, so I just think that, in 4 months, we'll have a clear idea in the spring, whatever that is for IRCC. So when they actually tell us what's happening with these points, if they're going to keep the 200 points for entrepreneurs, fine, we continue as we are. If they're taking away the 200 points from express entry, well, the LMIA and the work permit will get you here. But remember, with all of our skilled worker streams, it doesn't actually get you points. Like when you're working as the owner of the business, you don't actually get points for, federal skilled worker or for the provincial programs. So we then maybe, if they're purchasing a business in Canada, I think one strategy could be to stay a minority shareholder of the business, come in as an employee, and then transition to permanent residency and complete the purchase after permanent residency. So maybe delay it a little bit. Another option, if the person has a spouse, the spouse could come in with the business owner and then maybe work at the company or in another company to then go through the permanent residency route. There are provincial programs. I find them a little bit fickle, like unreliable, in that the provinces like to open and close them without any notice. So I don't really like to rely on them. But all of this to say, we do have a few options for our clients. We don't like to rely on just one program.
Okay, understood, duly noted. Everybody's taking notes, and we're gonna have a lot of LMIA owner-operator requests next week. Can you talk about some tips on how to navigate like the challenges of the owner-operator application process to increase clients' chances of success?
Sure. Well, I thought I might walk through, like, as a practitioner when you're working with a client. So first and foremost, I do a lot of co-counseling, and practitioners will come to me and they'll have had a client retain them for one of these applications, and they really have not charged enough money at all because it's not your regular LMIA and work permit process. You are reviewing the business plan. Sometimes you're communicating with the sellers to really appease them and try to placate them and try to get them to wait. So you really do have to be careful about setting expectations with your client, because the client has to be doing still the majority of the work. You're not actually running the business for them. It needs to be very clear. And so make sure that you're charging accordingly. And then from there, you need to set up the process for the LMIA. So that's with the business plan, working with your business plan provider. making sure that you're reviewing that the client is actually actively involved in reviewing that you're doing the advertising, instructing your client about how to run the ads and review the applicants, and then making sure that everything comes together in time to submit to the government. And then we prep the ESDC can do interviews. It's quite common nowadays that they'll interview the employer. And so they don't want to talk to you as an immigration representative during these interviews. So we're usually prepping the employers to be able to navigate this interview successfully, because that's the make or break point when it comes to the LMIA application. And then from there, we also, because we move on to the work permit process, usually at that point, but you want to be working with your client in tandem on the work permit application so that it's also ready to go once you have that LMIA approval.
Okay, great. Jade, what's your overall approval success rate for these LMIA owner-operator applications?
Well, I have a good success rate, but I say this with a caveat because I have a lot of people who come to me with a brand new startup and I don't take them. This is a matter of ethics more so, because I say, look, like if I file for an LMIA right now for you, it's going to get refused because they've maybe, they have incorporated the business and they maybe have a loose business plan and then that's it, but there's no business, right? Like, remember, an LMIA is to show that you have an active labor shortage, not one that's going to be in the future. So when you think about it like that, it helps me as a practitioner, and I think this helps others too. It's about, okay, does this active business have a labor shortage now? Like if someone comes to Canada tomorrow, is there something that they're going to be working on? And so we have to make sure that that is reflected in the LMIA application. So I have a good rate, but I'm conservative with who I take on as these clients. Some practitioners, they're a little bit more, they have a little bit more, they're less conservative in that they'll take on these files where they, it is more of a startup and they are starting with the application where there's very much, not much happening in the business. So it really depends on the, on the application and who you are as a practitioner. So I have a good success rate. I've had one owner-operator refusal, but then we reapplied, so it got approved. But that's again with the caveat that I don't take on businesses that are brand new. I will say, you can either go work with somebody else or work with me. We'll wait, let me help you become operational. I'll advise you, and then I'll file LMIA so that you're not, sad on a call with me in 2 months, your LMIA is refused.
Exactly.
And work with them to make sure that they have a strong file so that we are working towards, a successful application.
Okay, so good approval rates, but very high standards and playing it safe.
Yeah, and that's
yeah.
One last thing on that. That's where the business plan, of course, like the officer likes to see it. I'm not sure that they read all 60 pages of our business plan, but I really like it because it makes my clients actually, it makes them write out what is going to actually happen with the business. And remember, when we're writing these applications, you're writing it as it's different from if you're doing an ICT startup work permit, you can say it's a startup. Whereas with these, you're writing it as if the business is operational and that it's more of a, business growth plan. So there are two different ways in which we write them, but I find them to be really helpful because it makes my business people really think through what the steps are for their business, and it makes for a stronger application.
Exactly. It's an exercise for their own sake of strategic planning as well. So that's always a benefit. What are those key elements, now that we're talking about the business plan, Jade, to maximize the chances of approval for an owner-operator?
Within the business plan, Marianella, or just in general?
No, within the business plan.
Sure. Yeah. So if we're trying for a senior managerial role, so there are a few key points. One of them is a staffing plan. If you submit a business plan where there's only going to be one or two staff, well, the officer is going to look at it and they're going to say, well, this isn't a senior managerial role, because if you're only managing one person, then it's just not big enough of a business to warrant that role. So you really have to show that, well, I would never file an application if there were 0 staff in the Canadian business. We always want at least a couple of staff to show, because remember, it needs to be an existing business. So you're going to step into the role and be managing people in departments right away. Also, as far as financial forecasts within the business plan, remember that magical 300K number. So I think you usually do 3 years in your business plans, Marianella. So we want to see that first year that you actually are going to be doing that turnover in the first year. And then also the startup costs. So the startup costs, and then as it is not, even if it's a startup, we want to show what's actually been done already in the business, because we want to show that it's operational and not that it's a brand new startup. Even if it is, but the argument you're making is that it's an operational business.
Wonderful. So Jade, going back a little bit to the like taking on clients, from 10 clients that come to you for an owner operator, how many do you really end up taking on? Like ballpark?
Probably 4, maybe 5, maybe even less, honestly, because there's a lot of interest. And it's not that, it's not that we don't work with them at all. It's just that often, there are other immigration pathways that work better for them. It really depends on the client, because, a business client can come to us, but maybe they have a better option to, they have friends that have businesses in Canada. Maybe they just get a job offer through them. That's why it's about working with the client directly and understanding who they are, what their background is, and what their needs are.
So advice to be extremely selective and then explore alternatives. Is there any selectivity regarding which industries you take on for these applications?
Yeah, so within these, when I'm on these calls for these interviews with ESDC, they often will, they will want to see that it's operational, and that to be senior managerial, you have to have departments and usually multiple locations is what they want to see. They're a little bit more flexible. I've seen anecdotally that, again, if it's a tech startup with a lot of financial backing, they'll let us get away with just one location. Businesses that I have a harder time with are construction companies, home-based businesses. You have to be really careful with those. I think that, and just to point out to everybody, you don't have to do a senior managerial knock code with these applications. There's nothing stopping you from saying, so-and-so is going to be the manager, so not the senior manager, like 00 knock, like he or she's just going to be a regular manager. But to date, it hasn't given us the 200 points that we want, so it's kind of useless for express entry. But if your purpose is to just get your client into Canada, well, the bar, like the threshold for approval for a managerial position is a lot lower. And you could always bring somebody in on that managerial type LMIA and work permit, and then file for another LMIA to do a senior manager role once they've come to Canada and grown the business. But that's really long-term planning, but it could be done. But generally speaking, if you're trying to get those 00 senior managerial knock codes approved, we want to see that how an ESDC officer explained it to me one time is that the person is not actually doing any of the work. They're just at the top as the senior manager, and they're directing the managers to do the actual work. So that's how you differentiate between the senior manager and the manager. And so in your business plan, in your submissions, in your job duties, that should really be reflected if you want that 00 knock to be approved.
Wonderful, Jade. And there's still uncertainty as to whether that's going to happen from spring, or if you apply now, you can maybe take advantage of the fact that it is still not firm. What do you think about that? Like before spring
Yeah,
2025, do
I
you think
mean,
there's an opportunity there or?
yeah, I mean, to be again back down to ethics, I am telling clients, like, you know, if you file for this right now, it might not give you the 200 points in express entry as of spring. Like, it just is what it is. As far as of what the government will do, I'm not sure. I think I would be, I mean, it's going to really curtail immigration for business people if they take away the 200 points. So they may do it and then reinstate it. It's up in the air at the moment. I don't really know. But for now, we're planning that the points will be gone.
Okay. So to play it safe, but I mean, if people apply before, there's still a room for discussion, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Perfect. So most of the questions from that we have from registrants that they added when they were going to the webinar, we've gone through most of them. So I'm gonna pick a few of them that we haven't. So one of them is, what is the latest temporary foreign work permit position on asking and justifying an investment in the company?
Yeah, so that's with regards to having it in the job postings or in the job offer letter. That's about if you request an investment and say it's mandatory, in my experience, they'll refuse the LMIA.
Okay, perfect. There's a question about startups in the trade business specifically. The registrant is asking whether C10, C11, or LMIA owner-operator, which is better?
Yeah, so owner-operator, if you're trying to get the senior managerial knock in you mean like trade as in like import-export, correct? Not like trades as
Correct.
in, okay.
No, import-export, correct.
So it depends on, remember with those entrepreneur work permits, they're tricky in that you have to show that there's a significant benefit. So just a general like trade, like import export business, it's not going to be enough to warrant one of those work permits unless it's like something really specific that Canada doesn't have, or like maybe you're setting up shop in like, you know, northern Saskatchewan or something where they need to have job creation. But with the exception of that, it probably isn't going to work. And so that's where if you get the business set up, and I did one of these for a client from India. He had a couple of locations and he set up a Canadian business. He filed for an LMIA, but again, he was already operational and then they approved his application. So it can be done. It's just that he had a big, like if you see my point there is that he had operations in, well, 4 other countries other than Canada. So it was easy to show that like the global group of companies required a senior manager.
Okay, understood. But was there an edge to the trade, or was it regular import-export?
Just regular import export of goods. Like it was just like what was it? Can't remember off the top of my head. Anyway,
Yeah,
it was
like general trade. Yeah,
yeah,
because for the significant benefit also they would be inclined towards the export part of things, right? More than the import part of things.
exactly.
Okay, but in those cases, I mean, let's say they do have the significant benefit behind it, would you recommend owner-operator or C10 or C11?
Well, it depends too. So a few things, because remember with the LMIA, they have to become operational before we can file for it. So the question becomes, is the is the business owner able to become operational enough for us to file for the LMIA? In that case, like that we were filing for, I remember now, it was import export of electronics, and so he was able to get the business operational. He did a year of business and we did the LMIA. Whereas, if the person's unable to do it, maybe, maybe C10 makes more sense for him because of the nature of the business and because it's more of a startup.
Okay, understood. And you were mentioning, Jade, before when we were discussing previously about the C10 and C11 being like kind of a last resort, also given the multiple refusals and what they're expecting in those programs?
Correct. Yeah. So honestly, C10, C11, I usually reserve them for my clients who don't need a TRV for Canada. I find that they're just too highly volatile, and it ends up being a refusal on the person's permanent immigration record, which as I said earlier, is not good for, business people in general for future visa applications. So, if you try for the LMIA and they don't give it to you, well, you can still try for C10 and C11. Like there's no refusal, or you can resubmit. Like there's no refusal that goes on the person's immigration record.
Okay, definitely a benefit. This is my last question before I go to the Q&A on the questions tab. How will prorogation of the Parliament affect ESDC, LMIA laws, rules, and policies?
Sure. Well, I mean, in general, with that and the upcoming election, I mean, we're seeing a general tightening of immigration programs in general, probably with the election upcoming. The government also announced reductions in federal workforce recently as well at IRCC. I'm not sure about ESDC, so that usually equals longer processing times overall.
Okay. Thank you, Jade. Let's go to the questions that we have from the audience. We have a few. So we have a question from Quang. Thank you, Quang. Can you please describe a bit about the interview ESDC is carrying out with the applicant? And do they allow the consultant to sit alongside at all? Wait, you're muted, Jade.
Sorry. So the interview, when the officer, a few things. They send an email and they don't say, I'm inviting you for an interview on this date at this time. They'll just say, hi, I want to connect with you. I have a few questions. Like they don't even call it an interview, which if you don't prep your employers, they think it's a quick call and then they end up on this hour-long interview that they're not ready for. So always, right, your first lesson is, as a representative, always prepare your employers in advance. So maybe a month after submission, I will download the submitted application and I go through every single question with my employer just to make sure that they're ready to answer the questions that are asked by the ESDC officer. The officer will usually just, like, they quite literally are going through those questions and making sure that the answers are still the same. So if you don't go over it with the employer, sometimes they'll be searching for, because they'll be like, tell me about the position. What's this position doing? But if you say it off of the top of your head, it's not going to match the same duties that are in what you filed in the submission. So we want to make sure that the employers are properly, ready for those applications. And then next, we also, with regard to that question about can the rep sit on the interview? Yes, but they do not want to hear from you as the representative. I had one or two officers who would, I don't know, they just wanted to make an approval. So they called me with a few questions, then they approved it. Okay. But 99% of the time, they will set it up directly with the employer. Some officers are nice and they will CC you and invite you to participate. Others, they just completely leave you off of CC and are seemingly annoyed that you've joined in on the call. Some representatives let the employers go it alone. I never ever do, because I like to be there jotting down notes for any time there's an issue, preparing your employers so that if they're unsure of an answer, we don't want them guessing when it comes to a response. They can say, I'm not sure, let me get back to you on that, because that allows you to come up with an answer that's actually correct and not one that they're just guessing at. So I really spend time with my employers to, and in this case would be the business person, to really prepare them for that interview so that they feel ready to go into that interview and answer any questions that are asked of them.
And it has to do with trying to align legitimacy in everything, right? They want to make sure that it's not something that has built only for the purpose of the application, but that it's really happening and that they know what they're talking about. If they're a business person, they should, right?
Exactly. So that goes back to the business plan. So when your business person has been actively involved in writing it and reviewing it and editing it with you, they're going to be very prepared for that interview. If you as a representative just do the business plan mostly for them and figure it all out for them, you're doing them a disservice because they're going to get to that interview and they're going to have no idea what they're talking about because they didn't write the business plan and they don't understand the business. So that's why it's really, it needs to be equal, 50-50 between the two of you, putting the work into putting the application together.
Exactly. We have a question from Brooke. Thank you, Brooke. Can you provide an example of how you can get a startup operational prior to the owner having a work permit to work on the business in Canada?
Sure. So if it's a startup, the one example was my accounting firm. So I had him do a few things. I had him rent an office space. I had him set up a website. I had him hire an employee to work at the business. I had him take on clients. I had him generating revenue. So all of those things made it such that he was operational. If it's such that, and then, you can hire the employee. There's really nothing stopping you from doing all of this. Some people might argue with you that I can't do this because I'm not there, but that's not true. You can hire a general manager or an assistant or somebody to help you with the actual physical requirements of setting up the business. And then a lot of our clients will have business visitor visas. And so if you actually need to if the client needs to physically be here to do any of the business setup, if they have to attend meetings or they want to come see the business in person or locations, you can file for a business visitor visa before, they start through this process for them. So that's, as representatives, that's a lot of the time, that's the initial engagement that we have with a business person. So, we do a business visitor visa. We work with the seller, the broker, the local business, development center to get letters of invitation saying this is legitimate. And then we put an itinerary together by return flights, etc. So we put that all together so that the person can come and do site visits, etc. And you put an itinerary together. This is if they are, it can be either one. They can either be purchasing a business or doing a startup. If it's a startup, you get invites from, maybe industry connections. Maybe they're going to this, and this during a 2-week trip to Canada. And you put it together so that the person can come, interview people, set up a space, etc. Or some people do it from abroad. It really depends on the client.
Okay, that's a really good question. Marjan, thank you for reminding me because this was one of the topics that I wanted to mention. For Jade, how can we work with you for these types of applications? Have you set any process for those RCICs that want to work with you in business immigration?
Sure. So I have my immigration education platform, which is Levo. The URL is levosolutions.ca. You can book a one-on-one with me directly there, so we can meet and chat about your application. I also offer co-counseling where I can either, during our one-on-one sessions, that's where if you just have questions for me, I can help you through an application, or we can co-counsel and co-represent a client on these types of applications.
And Jade, you have high standards for that too, I imagine, to make sure that they're eligible before you take on the co-counseling as well.
So usually we will have a consultation together with the client, or I review the client's details before we, of course, engage with the client.
Okay. We have a question from Hina. Would a restaurant qualify for an owner-operator?
Well, the only thing it depends on which NOC code. If you're trying to get a senior manager, it depends. If you have 3 restaurants and you need a president of that group of companies to run the business, fine. But my only thing there is that you may, like if it's just one restaurant, I think you'd be really hard pressed to say that you required a senior manager. So in that case, you could maybe do a lower level NOC code if you're wanting to get the person here on a work permit. I think that without multiple locations, you would be hard pressed to get a senior like 00 NOC approved for that type of LMIA.
Okay. We have a question from Manpreet. Hi Manpreet, are there any ineligible businesses? If so, can these be addressed with some practical and credible solutions?
Well, there's nothing like ESTC doesn't list any types of businesses as being ineligible. Like some of the provincial programs for business immigration, they'll say like if you have like a real estate investing business or like gas stations, for example, like you can't file. ESTC doesn't have any restrictions in that regard, but it's more so, as we've talked about, if they're not operational, if they're not big enough to warrant a senior manager, if they aren't doing business, don't have significant revenue, that's where it's not that they're not eligible, it's just they're going to get refused is the issue.
Okay, a question from Odunola. If you buy an existing business, do you then apply for an LMIA to come run the business? Would that be based on your managerial experience or what? Also, what percentage of ownership would be required?
Sure. So if you're purchasing the business, so remember with the LMIA, now there's no requirement when it comes to ownership. You can file for a high level, like a 00 NOC code, whether you have 10% to majority shares. So that's really up to you, but truly it's only, in my opinion, it's only owner-operator if you have majority shares of the business. And so the actual LMIA, the officers are not concerned about the candidate. Like if the candidate, has never operated a business, they really don't care. This is all about, is there a labor shortage? That's what ESTC is doing. They're evaluating the effect of hiring a foreign worker on the labor market. It's only when you come to the work permit application, that's when they're worried about the qualifications of the person. So, do they have 10 plus years of executive experience? Is their background and training in something relevant? And then, of course, the regular work permit requirements, which are their ties to the home country, et cetera, et cetera.
A question from Joanna. So an owner puts a small amount of deposit for an LMIA So an owner puts a small amount deposit for LMIA applications. Do they need to complete the transaction of business for work permit application, or is it fine that the transaction is not complete as the LMIA decision only states the applicant's position, not mentioning the applicant has to be an owner?
Yeah, so that the government doesn't seem to care. I've always structured it as such that the foreign worker has to either be approved for a work permit or a permanent residency to complete the transaction, because think about it, you're representing your client. If they are forced to complete the transaction once the LMIA is approved, for example, they might not get a work permit or permanent residency still. So I've always had the lawyer structure it so that the transaction gets completed once the purchaser is approved for either a work permit or a permanent residency.
Okay, so it's contingent there.
Exactly.
Okay. I have two similar questions from Marjan and Kanwarshit. Um, what do you provide for the business legitimacy documents? How to prove financial requirements for owner-operator?
Sure. So that's a good question, because up until recently, we were able to provide an attestation from either a CPA or a lawyer saying that the owner was actively engaged in the business and that the business could afford the salary being offered to the foreign worker. Now, the only person who can provide that attestation is a senior bank, like manager or branch manager, which, as you can imagine, most people, they don't have those connections yet in Canada. So that's why I like to run the business for a year, because then the other tax documents that we're allowed to submit as far as business legitimacy, such as like the schedules 100 and 125, so the corporate schedules, as well as like the T2 summary of remuneration, those things are all provided after the business has been operational for 1 year. So, and if those look bad, meaning that you haven't declared a lot of revenue in the first year, and if you can't get a letter from a Canadian bank, then I like to include additional revenue or investment for the business to really demonstrate to the officer that the monies are available there to support the business and the person who will be working in Canada.
Thank you, Jade. There's a question from Marina regarding the job advertising. So it says, it is interesting that officers accept the advertising as genuine when there is an inherent conflict of interest within the owner-operator essentially stating, funny thing, I couldn't find anyone to replace me. Has anyone had an officer challenge recruitment genuineness?
Yeah, I agree with you, Marina. So that's why I called ESDC, I think about 4 times when this change first occurred. So yeah, they accepted as such, because if it's just a one person show in the Canadian corporation, like they don't have anybody else to do it, right? So it's just how it goes.
LMIA work permit is expiring in March 2025. The client is interested in applying for startup visa or becoming an entrepreneur. Is that possible? What does my client have to do?
Yeah, so
This goes
I
back
think,
to what we already covered.
well, but I think we haven't talked about one aspect of that, which I think is really important, which is, or interesting, is that we've talked about people who are starting up a business, and we've talked about people who are purchasing a business, but we haven't talked about people who are already in Canada on an open work permit who are operating a business already. So, as we've discussed, and as practitioners know, everything is tightening. And so the opportunity to transition to permanent residency is maybe not there for everybody. So a lot of our clients, they're working maybe for somebody 30 hours a week, but they're also operating a business on the side because they want to make money on the open work permit, which they're completely able to do. It's completely legitimate. You can do whatever you want really on that open work permit, except study. And so we then if I have a client who comes to me and he or she is operating that business and their employer is not going to support an LMIA for them to continue in that job offer, well, this is completely an option for them as well, right? So somebody who's already in Canada operating that business, so check on the operational. And so for an LMIA, I think that it's up to the representative to determine, okay, does it warrant a senior level NOC, so a 00 NOC code, or just a regular manager? You could always try for both. You could run ads for both positions and see which one ESDC will approve. But I think it's not a bad option for those who are in Canada who don't have an employer to sponsor them. We're seeing a lot of people as a trend who are running out of status. They don't have employers to sponsor them, and so they're leaving or switching to visitor visa, to visitor record status within the country. And so if they're operating a business and have been for a while, I mean, the LMIA can be done for them, right? And so it is an option for those who are already in Canada. And a good one, I think.
Yes, and it encourages entrepreneurship as well. We have a question. Any net worth required for the investor, and how old should the business be to be eligible?
Sure. So a couple of things. I don't want us to call them investors because they're not investors, they're the business people. And I only say this because, again, for that active participation requirement, we don't want them to just think that they give the money and then, you make it all magically happen. We really want them to be actively involved in the process. And then how old should the business be? I prefer, if they'll wait 1 year, like that's what I think is safe to do, because then remember, as I said, to get that proof of business legitimacy, if it's not 1 year old, it's hard. You're going to be up against a lot when it comes to trying to convince ESDC that the business is legitimate. Like, I don't think you'll satisfy the business legitimacy requirement, so you have to be careful there. And then that speaks to that second part of the question about the financial strength. If it's a new business, you could submit a bank account and hope for the best, but that's why I like to now run it for 1 year, especially with the new restrictions on business legitimacy documentation, because then you can show your CRA tax documents and show that there's, some solid activity there for the business.
So if I understand correctly, the net worth here wouldn't be questioned necessarily because you're applying as the employee of that company.
Could you repeat that, Marianella?
Oh, that the question that was there was regarding the net worth. So it wouldn't be something that needs argumentation there, just because it's more on the standpoint of the employee, or?
So if you file where the applicant is the majority shareholder, that's what I consider to be an owner-operator. If the person does not have majority shares, I just consider them to be an employee who's coming in as a senior manager who just happens to have shares in the business, which if you're going to do that,
Okay.
maybe the shares should be bumped down to 10% so that they can qualify for some of the provincial programs. So both can work. Listen, both can work. It's their options. And especially if they're going to remove the points in the spring, maybe structuring the deal so that you're coming in as an employee at first and then, finalizing the purchase of the business after they get permanent residency, maybe that makes more sense, right? It really is up to, that's why I say it's all very nuanced, because you have to, put these together vis-a-vis what's happening with the policy at the federal level. But yes, between the two, there's owner-operator. To me, that's when there's a majority ownership of the applicant. If not, then they're just an employee. And so like the business plan and things like that, they don't really care about so much. Like owner-operator is where there's a majority shareholder, and that's where we're including the business plan to show like what's happening in the business.
Okay, that makes sense. I have a question that I think was done when we were talking about the ICT. So it's from Mandy. Does the multinational company need at least 1 year tax filing document to prove it is running, or newly opened company in 2 countries are fine?
No, I would have them operational for at least 1 year, because you're going to want to show tax filings for that business, right? You want to show tax filings, business bank accounts, operations. You also show an organizational chart for the entire global group of companies. They don't want people just, setting up a Delaware company for the purpose of having a second location, and that's not going to qualify you for the ICT. You have to be actively doing business in 2 other countries to now qualify.
This one is a little bit specific, but I'm gonna add it. So, question from Steven. Had my first C11 refusal for opening a cafe. The investment was above 300K with proof of funds, 4 to 5 jobs created, detailed business plan, proof of experience and assets abroad. This is a startup, so chances with LMIA, backing from the city and professionals also included.
Well, the issue there is the operations of the business. If the cafe is not operational, they're never going to give you an LMIA. So if they can somehow get it off the ground. But those are that's a business that you kind of have to be here, in my opinion, to make to get started, right? So in that particular case, I'd be more inclined to refile or appeal the federal court because of the nature of the business.
Brooke has a follow-up question. Would ESDC ever suggest that the job offer to the owner isn't valid, or there's no need because the business is already operating without them in Canada already?
No. So what they do, that's a good question. So any position that's not filled by a Canadian or a permanent resident, it's considered to be not filled permanently. I mean, that's the whole purpose of the LMIA. Like, you're trying to show that there's a legitimate job vacancy. So that's our job, right? To show that why does this business need this person to come and operate the business, and what will happen to, and the LMIA forms, they said there's a question on there that says, what will happen to the business if, this position remains unfilled? And that's where I make my argument. I say, this position needs to be filled because, we've hired this person this quarter. In the next 2 quarters, we're going to add 2 more staff. We've done this in revenue. We are gearing up to do this, this, and this as per our business plan. If it goes unfilled and we can't fill it with a foreign worker, or, we've been unable to fill it with a Canadian, and if we're unable to hire this foreign worker, I essentially make the argument it's going to be disastrous for the company. It's going to result in a downward turn in revenue. We're going to have to lay people off, yada, yada, yada.
Okay, wonderful. There are a few other questions there, but I'll let some attendees here reach out to you directly, Jade, in case they have very specific consultations or questions, because there are a few. But that only tells us that people are looking for options, right, for their clients, for them to be able to share what opportunities there are, what alternatives there are. So thank you so much, Jade, for giving us such nice information and very comprehensive about the LMIA owner-operator as an option. We know there are a lot of challenges, a lot of uncertainty, but this gives us a breath of fresh air, and thank you so much for that, Jade.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Bye, everybody. Thank you for being here. I think we had a lot of people connected, a lot of engagement, so thank you very much as usual. You'll all be receiving the recording at the end. Bye. We'll talk soon. Thank you, Jade.
Bye. Thanks again.